So if we look at this 10 by 10 grid, we can use this to understand what a decimal looks like. So this grid represents one whole. Now, since it's 10 by 10, or if you counted them all, you would see that there are 100 squares in the grid. So 1/10 of that, if we were going to shade that in, would just be one of these columns, like this. That's 1/10. That's what 1/10 looks like. Now, if we were going to shade in 100th, that would be just one of these squares because there's 100 squares. Now, if we wanted 1,000th, that would be really tough. You would have to cut this up into one of these up into 10 pieces, and then one of those little slivers would be 1,000th. That's what happens when you cut this entire square up into 1,000 little pieces. Each piece would be this big. So that's how you can think of tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. Here's our chart, our place value chart. You notice the decimal is right here. And before the decimal, we have ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, and most fifth graders know about this, but just to on top of, to understand the decimal portion, we would go in this direction, and we have tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and if you take a look at this, if I circled the ones here, you'll see that it's a mirror image. This is tens, tenths, hundreds, hundredths, thousands, and thousandths. And if you forget, how to, what they're called after the decimal point, you can kind of you can write it down for yourself, like if you're taking a test or something. We all remember tens, hundreds, thousands. Well, after decimal point, we can say tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and it all centers around the ones. We don't have oneths because that would because one is just one is just one whole. And if we had oneths, that would also be one whole. So we only have one of them. Now, you have to pronounce them correctly. Thousand is like having $1,000. So it has a D at the end. Thousand. Thousandth, well, that's like a dollar cut into 1,000 pieces. That's very, very small. So you have to say thousandth. Now, 100 ends in a D. That's like having $100. 100th. That's like 1/100th of a dollar, which is 1 penny. But you have to say hundredth. 1 penny is very different than $100. Now 10 is like $10, and 1/10 is like 10 cents. That's 1/10 of a dollar or a dime. So what we want to talk about today is how to multiply something by 10 or find 1/10 of something. And you see what that does on your place value chart. So if I start with 400ths and I wanted to find 10 times 400ths, well, let's see what 400ths is. On this place value, or on this grid, 400ths looks like 4 of these squares. If I wanted to multiply that by 10, it would get bigger. I would just fill in 10 of them, like this. And if you look at that, when I'm done, you'll notice it's 4 columns. We know one column is 1/10, so that gives us 4/10. And 4/10 looks like this, 0.4. Now I want you to take a look at where the decimal went, 0.04. When I multiply by 10, all I have to do is put the decimal to the right one place, and then I end up with 0.4. That's all you do when you multiply by 10. Now when you find 1/10 of something, it gets smaller. You're doing the opposite. So we're starting with 400ths, and we want to find 1/10 of that. So what I do is I would cut all of this up into 10 pieces, which would be a little bit difficult to do. But what you're going to end up with is something like each piece would be like this size. It'd be very small. And we're getting into thousandths territory. We did this in class and it was very hard to see once we drew that. But let's see what let me draw it down here. See what 4 thousandths looks like. Looks like this. Now, if we start with 4 hundredths and we find 1/10 of something, we move the decimal to the left one place and we get 0.004, and that's 4 thousandths. So we move the decimal to the left to make it smaller, we move it to the right to make it bigger. And that is multiplying by 10 or finding 1/10. So let's do this example. So 10 times 0.6, we move the decimal over to the right, and or 0.06, excuse me, that's 6 hundredths. 10 times that would be 6 tenths. So we're starting out with 6 little squares on our grid, and now we end up with 6 columns. Finding 1/10 of that, we go in the opposite direction, and we put the decimal to the left one place, and we end up with 6 thousandths. That's 6 little specks inside of one square. And here we have 9/10. If we were going to multiply that by 10, we'd move the decimal to the right, and then we would end up with 9 wholes. And if we were going to find 1/10 of something, we would move the decimal to the left, and we would end up with 9 hundredths. So we start out with 9/10, which is 9 columns, and then we multiply by 10 and we get 9 wholes, 9 big squares. And if we start out with 9/10 and we find 1/10 of that, we will end up with 9 hundredths, which is 9 of the little squares inside of the grid. Now, if I want to find 10 times 0.3, I would move the decimal to the right, and I would get 3. If I wanted to find 1/10 of 0.3, which is 1/10 of 3/10, I would move it to the left, and I would get 3 hundredths, like this. If I wanted to find 10 times 8 hundredths, I would move the decimal to the right, and I would get 8/10. And I'm starting out with 8 hundredths, which is 8 of those little squares inside my grid, and I'm ending up with 8 columns. So it gets bigger when you multiply by 10. If I want to divide by 10, excuse me, not what I meant to say is if I wanted to find 1/10 of 8 hundredths, I'd move the decimal to the left, and I would end up with 8 thousandths. That's 8 little tiny specks inside of one little square in a grid. Now finally, we have this model here, and we have some items on your homework that are like this. We want to write the decimal shown by the shaded part of the model. So what do we have here? We have, look how many columns we have shaded in. If we count them, we will have 9 columns. Let me try to write this with my mouse. There we go, 9 columns. And then we have, left over, we have 9 squares. That is 9 squares. And here we have this. What this is this empty box blown up so that you can see how much of it is shaded. And this little box is cut up into 10 pieces, and each one of these columns is 1/1000th. None of these are shaded in. So we have 9 columns and 9 squares. Well, 9 columns is, or 1 column is 1/10, so 9 columns is 9/10, like this. So I put a 9 in the 10th place. And these 9 extra squares are, each one of them is 100th. We have 9 of them, so we put 9 in the 100th place. And that's how you translate one of these into a number.